My name is Narbada. Thank you very much, Indra, for this opportunity. It's an honor to be on this panel. The purpose of life is not to be happy, but to matter, to be productive, to be useful, to have it makes some difference that you have lived at all, said Leo Roston. I have been struggling since I was 19 years old. Still I am struggling to get the rights and justice for marginalized people. The more I saw, the more I found injustice of different types, so that my experience is my education. When I was a human rights activist in Nepal, I was fighting against exploitation, abuse and discrimination. Now I am a community organizer at Adhikar in New York and fighting against abuse and exploitation. Adhikar is the only social justice organization in the Nepali-speaking community here in New York, as the only staff organization in the community. We also provide individual assistance and support. Today I am very happy to speak about combating domestic sweatshop because I have an experience that how I suffered when I worked as a domestic worker. First day I found food discrimination. My employer did not allow to eat brown bread. She said that white bread is for worker and brown bread for employee. I felt sad and asked her why employee and worker have different food. She said brown bread is more expensive. That means worker have to eat cheap quality. How much difference is there between white and brown bread? $1 or $2? That was my employer's way of dehumanizing me. Working more than 14 hours and getting $350 for 6 days. What kind of exploitation? It hurt me. And I decided I would go hungry, but I would not tolerate exploitation and discrimination. I committed that I had to do something and quit the job. I became sad. I thought this is the country of law, but for marginalized people, wherever we go, everywhere, it is the same. Just 1 week ago, I was going home after work. I stopped by a grocery shop. I met a lady from my country. We introduced ourselves. She has heard about our organization. All the time, I am thinking about people's working condition. She said me that she was working 6 days, 15 hours a day and got $275. Oh my God, I got angry. I asked her, why don't you come to our office? She said that she got sick because she was only allowed to eat twice a day, morning 11 a.m. and evening 11 p.m. She started her work morning 7 a.m. and finished by night 11 p.m. What kind of exploitation? I could not imagine. Being their pet animals is better than being their domestic worker. Some diplomats and UN officials bring domestic workers from their home countries. Officers are getting their salary in US dollar and most do not pay taxes and do not even pay parking tickets. And for the domestic workers, they often pay in their home currency and very little money, and some don't even pay at all. It is hard to believe that people who are supposed to protect our rights are exploitation the most vulnerable in their own homes. One of our members was brought here when she was 17 years old. And for more than 3 years of work, she received a one-time pay of $120. Yes, $120. For domestic workers, it is very hard to live because where can they go without documents? Their employers often keep their documents also. As soon as they leave, they become out of status. Who is responsible for them? Are they not a human being? Do they have no rights as others? I usually go to temple, I meet sisters and brothers. When I ask them about their working condition, they said, we do not have problems, but I knew they are suffering from exploitation. It was challenge to convince them, motivate them, and make them aware. They were not ready to listen to me because they did not have a reason to trust me. Luckily, I got the opportunity to work at Adhikar. I am very grateful for this opportunity at Adhikar. We organized group discussion at our office. First time, I could not believe that they were crying a lot, taking out their deep pain and said what they were suffering. We encouraged them to speak up and that they are not alone. We found a lot of our sisters were not getting enough food, working very long hours, sleeping on the floor even if there was a spare bed, and not getting minimum wage. Some of them were not even getting paid for 8 years, 12 years, 7 years of work with no rest and no holiday. We started by sharing stories among ourselves and we soon started speaking with others. Through our English class, our domestic workers, sisters learned about their rights and responsibilities and became more confident. We attended the campaign meeting for the New York Domestic Worker Bill of Rights and we went on to testify in Albany and march and held vigil and speak out. Together we have demonstrated that if we raise our voice collectively, we can make difference. Domestic Workers Bill of Rights passed and became law. I must mention the commendable work of Domestic Worker United, Joyce and Eisenhower, which played a key and vital role to pass this bill in the New York State. Passing the law took us 6 years of hard work. We celebrated, but our work is not yet done. We have to make sure that the law is implemented. 200,000 domestic workers must know their rights. Now is the time to educate the employers that slavery is done. We want our respect, recognition, and be equally valued as other workers. Thank you.
Gail Campbell. I'm the organizing coordinator of Domestic Workers United. And Domestic Workers United is the organization that is made up of nannies, housekeepers, and elderly caregivers. And we've been organizing to build power, gain respect, fair labor standards, and to help change the working conditions in this country once and for all. Now this industry has an enormous force of women of color who came to this country because the economic policies around the world force us abroad to support our families. Globalization has hurt us when our countries are forced to cut services, close down factories, and there's no work. Those who are responsible for taking care of their families end up here in the U.S. or other big countries taking jobs in the domestic work industry. In the New York metropolitan area, there are over 200,000 domestic workers, all immigrant women of color. But despite the important work they do, which is to provide critical care for New York's professional family, they are treated less than real workers and are vulnerable to the worst abuses. This is not their fault, but this is a result of over 7 decades of exclusion from major labor protections which were first developed during the New Deal. When FDR signed the National Labor Relations Act, the Southern Democrats lobbied for domestic workers and farm workers to be excluded because they did not want African Americans to assert any real power. To this day, this remains unchanged. Without the legal protection guaranteed to other workers, domestic workers routinely endure dehumanizing treatment and exploitation. You just heard Andy Narbada spoke of some of the exploitations that workers face, and she herself. But I want you to understand this. Before I became a full-time organizer, when I first migrated to this country, it wasn't because of globalization. It was because maybe I'm one a little different from that. I came behind the love of my life. And actually, I was enrolled in the Allen School where I was pursuing a career in nursing. So I took a job as a babysitter to help with the expenses. And it's while working in that industry that I realized that something was tremendously wrong. Something was tremendously wrong because what I'm going to tell you is not in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, nor the early 1990s. I was employed as a babysitter with a family here in Manhattan. And actually, it was one little girl, and she was a stay-at-home mom, and he was an investment banker. And I want you to listen to this carefully. I was paid $271 every 2 weeks. That's $135.50 per week, which is a lot less than number that I have just told you people were working for. And like I said, this is not the 70s, 80s, nor the early 90s. It was late 90s. Because I'm telling you, you know, and while working in that industry in that little time, is when I realized something was tremendously wrong. Going into the playgrounds and listening to the nannies speak about the way they were treated, the living nannies could not have anything to eat until the family they worked for finished eating. Then they were allowed to go to the table and eat what was left. And then I realized, you know, I have it bad, but there are other people out there that had it worse. And that's when I became involved with Domestic Workers United. I actually believe and I decided that someone has got to be a voice for the voiceless. And that's when I got together with Agent Fu and the others. And I remember when Domestic Workers was formed, it was only formed in the year 2000. 2000. And at that time, we realized that the agencies were exploiting the workers because there were no guidelines. And that was our first target. So we got together with Councilwoman Gail Burer and the then Councilman Bill Perkins. And what they drafted was a city legislation to address some of the problems within the industry. And that was the first piece of legislation we had passed in 2003. That's Local Law 33, better known as the Nanny Bill. And that mandates and the employers give their workers actually a job description. And failing to do this, they will have to pay a fine. But that did not solve the problems. So late in 2003, we held the first ever convention in New York. And at the time, we had about 200 workers. So we passed out the survey and asked them what they wanted. And they actually said they wanted paid vacation, sickness benefit, and all these women were asking for was to be treated like real human beings, to be given the protection that other workers were given. So at that convention, we had a vision. And the vision we had was the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. We listened to their stories, and we had that data to create something that will right the wrong that was meted out to this industry more than 300 years ago. And I'm saying today that what is happening now should have been corrected years ago, not now. So here we have this industry. Women are looking after the people's rights possession. And my question to a lot of the employers, what is really your rights possession? Is it the shoes you wear? Because they pay more for a pair of shoes than they pay their worker. I work for the same couple I work for. I remember they had a beach house in Jersey, and they had some friends coming over for the big weekend. He used to have scores of people down there, and his wife was going to marinate some meat, and she used this particular bottle of wine, and he almost killed her when he came in, because that bottle of wine cost $150. That one bottle of wine cost $150, and I was paid $271 every 2 weeks, which was $135.50, which was less than he paid for a bottle of wine. So here we see grossly the exploitation and the abuse. But one thing that they do is underestimate the intelligence of the immigrants. Because when we migrate to this country, we migrate here, but we have left great jobs in our country. Some of the people in this domestic industry are nurses, some are doctors. I used to teach in my country. So, therefore, we have the knowledge in this industry to educate those and to bring up everyone up to a level, a standard that they can actually negotiate and fend for themselves. So that's one of the initiatives that Domestic Workers United did. And my story is not only unique, because we had Marina, one of our members, and she was from Colombia, and she works for a household, and she was looking after this handicapped kid, and actually she used to sleep in the basement where the sewage overflow. So she had to put cardboard to go to and fro. Well, actually she was brought from Colombia here, so she had no relatives. And then in the dead of the night, they called her up and said, "We don't need your services anymore. No way to go." And she was paid $2 per hour for the work that she was doing, which was less than the minimum wage in this country. As we celebrate this 100-year landmark of the Triangle Fire, what I want to draw to your attention, the domestic workers work is so similar to that of the sweatshops. They work long hours for little wage. They held up one servitude because their passports are taken from them. Their movements are restricted. And they're told if you go out there and you talk to anyone, the immigration will get you. They put that fear within the workers. And one of the things we as domestic workers have done during our fight from the beginning for the domestic workers bill is to concentrate a lot on the education. We educate them all about the rights. We started programs that will benefit them tremendously. We've done the nanny training course, which is going on every year. And we've graduated more than 1,000 domestic workers for our nanny training course, which is held in association with Cornell University. These members do basic psychology, pediatrics, resume writing, housekeeping, and they do CPR, and at the graduation they're given a Cornell certificate, which now is recognizable by the employers. We also took an initiative because it's a diverse group, and we know that there was a language barrier. So we introduced the ESL classes, which is English as a second language, and which members have benefited tremendously. Now, we fought for the domestic workers' Bill of Rights. 6 years of struggle. 6 years of going to Albany. 6 years of educating the legislators. 6 years because when we first went to Albany about this bill and started to educate them about the domestic workers, they wanted to know if we meant domestic violence. You imagine that, when some of them themselves have domestic workers, but we knew they did not want the industry addressed because it would stop them from continuing to exploit workers. So, but the more they put up resistance, the more we strategize. We built coalition, and the coalition was very important. I remember going to Albany, and Susan John gave us a hell of a time. And we decided we've got to get Susan John away from Albany, away from Silver, where she can really be herself, because we know they had a part to play. And it was 3 of us that chatted to Rochester. And when we got there, I asked Susan John, we've done everything you all wanted us to do. We changed around the bill to suit you. What can we do now? And she said, you know what, go back down and hold a public hearing of domestic workers. I'll come down and I'll share. And we came back down, we went to our assembly sponsor, which was Keith Wright, and he said, okay, and we did everything we had to do. We do our research. At that time, historian Pamela, Professor Pamela was there. She was working with us. And we pulled in some of the heaviest group because we had no political power. And having no political power, we had to reach people that can address them. Because one of the stupid things they asked us in Albany, who are the celebrities that you have on your side? We have no money. We are a group that was actually, we are very popular now because of what we have achieved. But nobody knew who we were. And the only thing we can do is to reach the activists like Barbara Aaron Wright and Gloria Snyder. And they came on board and they strategized with that. And at that hearing, I remember clearly when the panel testified and other people testified, employers testified. And one of the things that when Susan John said, you have workers who are unemployed, and you, when this bill is passed, you know, they will lose their work. How do you feel? I said, right now we don't have the bill and they're losing their work. We have nothing to lose. We had nothing to lose because people were losing their jobs and there wasn't any bill. And if people lost their jobs, when there's a bill, we lost nothing. And Keith Wright said, I wonder if what would happen if we called a strike. Because if we were to call a strike one day in this state of New York with over 200,000 domestic workers, you can imagine the city. Schools closed, hospital closed, everything at a standstill. But we treated them with more dignity and respect. We treated them the way people should be treated. And that is like giving them the chance to come to terms and to right the wrong. So that is one thing that we did. We held rallies, we held marches, we held vigils, we had a 24 vigil outside City Hall. You name it, we braved the storm, the winter, the rain, the sun, and because we know what we meant. It was a matter of determination, a matter of fighting for the over 200,000 domestic workers. It was a fight for the women who were afraid to speak out. And like I said, someone had to do the speaking. So we mobilized and we formed the first ever National Domestic Workers Alliance. And when we formed that National Domestic Workers Alliance, there were 11 organizations. And now 3 years later, well, this is going 4 years, but in 3 years, that had tripled to 33 organizations, 17 cities, and 11 countries. The organization is now fully staffed and now embodied all the other organizations. Domestic workers is now protected. It is true, we did not get everything we wanted. For those workers who work 40 hours, which means that they come home every day, those live-out nannies, they're entitled to overtime at time and a half, the regular rate. And I say the regular rate because what a few employers were doing that were paying overtime, they were paying it at the minimum rate. Which I mean that if people were getting $10 per hour, instead of giving them the $15, they were paying it at the minimum rate. We have protection now. We have against harassment based on your sex, race, creed, whatever. We have those who work 40 hours must have workers' compensation. And one of the things, the beautiful things of it, we didn't get paid vacation. But there are provisions in our bill that unions have to negotiate and have contracts for, that this organization, not the union, was successful in achieving for the over 200,000 domestic workers in this country. We have the country, and like you've heard, California, and their bill will be actually paused the 31st, which is next week, Thursday. And now Boston, Massachusetts is on the way to doing the same thing. One thing that really annoyed me is when we were fighting for this bill, very few of the feminist movements came out in support of us. And as I think I remember, National Organization of Women never really supported us. They never cared about the workers, but they honored the work that we have done 3 weeks ago by giving us an award. When you think about the work that we're doing, and people that used to say, you could not do it, are calling us and asking us, how did you do it? That's my greatest joy. It's that here they ask us, how did you do it? Can you teach us how you do it? But what we are doing, we are putting together a toolkit. of work that we've done over the years to share with our members. The fight is not over. We've just started our Know Your Rights campaign. We have some members who will be trained, who are being trained right now as ambassadors, which is like the shop stewards. They will be the first point of contact to the workers. We will be having them out there in the different boroughs, and they will be working between the domestic workers. They will take their cases, and they will fill it to us, and we have lawyers at Urban Justice Center who work for us pro bono. But I want you to understand another victory we've been doing. For all the time we've been organizing, we've been having legal representations for the women. We've won more than $500,000 for domestic workers in this country who have been exploited and abused, and they were all undocumented. They were all undocumented. We have never lost a case yet, and we have no intentions of losing it. So that is our fight. We will continue to fight for that, and we will continue to build relationships. We are also working with the Department of Labor, where we will be we are still working along the collective bargaining. We are addressing that through the employers' dialogue, which is that the Just Racial and Economic Justice, they actually bring employers together. So as you know how the labor law is structured, 12 to 15 people should be all employed under one umbrella to collectively bargain. So we've seen and we've looked at different models, and we even went back into looking at old car potters and those different union models. And we realized that if we can get at least 100 employers together, that is 100 workers. So we are modeling and going towards that collective bargaining issue. And when you think about it, and you think about the domestic workers, and then you think about the things that people are saying about us. And I heard you spoke about Hilda Solis. On Monday, we are having an impersonal meeting in the White House with Hilda Solis to address this issue. And another beauty and the victory that we have created is that in June 2011, which is this year, the International Labor Organization will be moving a convention on decent work for domestic workers. So this fight is not only moving from locally to nationally, it is going international. And our dream is a dream that we have, that one day all work will be valued equally. And we know that that day will come when domestic workers will be covered under the labor law like all other workers. And one of the things that I really do enjoy the work that I'm doing. I'm very passionate about it, but the more my workers, my members are exploited, the more strength I get to go out there and fight for right the wrong that have been meted to the workers in this industry. And as I close, I would like all of those of you who are involved in movements to remember this, that every moment is an organizing moment and a movement, building movement. It is the consciousness, the bridges, and the relationships that we build through the process of fighting together and translate into a long-term progressive power. So I said power to the people. Power to the people.
That was wonderful, Eileen. As we think about the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Factory Fire, and especially, I think, both the tragedy and the heroism that marked the lives of the 146 young women who died there, I think a question that we have to ask 100 years later is what has changed? And I think it's very disheartening to actually look around us right now at the state of work, at the state of the American workforce. There's been a resurgence of garment sweatshops across the country. There are attacks on public sector workers. There are not just pockets of poverty, but huge swaths of poverty around this country of people who are unemployed that I think has left communities, entire communities, that are completely devastated. And we've seen an increasing reliance on undocumented immigrant labor, especially women's labor. So I think in many ways a lot of parallels to the early 20th century. The immigrant labor, women's labor, low-wage labor, the lack of protection. One difference, of course, is that much of the work today is not manufacturing work here in the United States, but it's service sector work. So we've seen a tremendous increase in service sector work, which of course includes domestic work, and a decline in manufacturing work. I think another similarity with the early 20th century is the way in which immigrant women like Joyce and Narbada have led massive, powerful organizing efforts. And in many ways, they have defied the expectations and the stereotypes, not just of their employers, right, but also of mainstream labor leaders. And I think one of the things we could talk about is the way in which this movement is really redefining the landscape of labor organizing, not just the field of domestic service. So they really are a beacon of hope, I think, in what is otherwise a very depressing political climate. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the labor regulations that have been instituted over the past 100 years, as well as the contemporary political struggle that I think is trying to redefine the meaning of work and regulation. One of the things I think that distinguishes the contemporary period from the early 20th century is now we do have a large number of labor laws that are in place. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fires didn't have the same kind of labor laws to protect them, right? So after the Triangle Factory in New York City, there were a whole host of labor regulations that were passed, including child labor laws, safety regulations, minimum wage laws. In fact, Francis Perkins, a labor leader, called March 25th, the date of the fire, the day that the New Deal began. Right? But that was just the beginning. In the 1930s, there were, another whole series of laws that were passed in the midst of the Great Depression. But the question I want to ask is, what has been the limits of this labor regulation? Right? What have been the historical limits? And how does the struggle of domestic workers help us understand what these limits are? Labor regulation in this country has been geared towards certain categories of workers, as several people have already said. The New Deal, which I think was the most important period of regulation, was an extremely important step in expanding the rights and protections of workers. And by many labor historians and progressives and scholars, it's recognized as a watershed moment in the history of labor because of the way in which, after that moment, workers did in fact have certain kinds of protections. But of course, not all workers were included in those labor regulations. As Joyce said, African American workers, who were largely in the field of agricultural labor and domestic work, were excluded because of their race. It wasn't incidental. So I think the New Deal, which includes the Fair Labor Standards Act, which gave us minimum wage protections and overtime pay, the Social Security Act, which provides for assistance once you retire, as well as the National Labor Relations Act, which grants workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. Right? Those three laws excluded important sectors of workers. And I think what this did is it actually created a structural inequality among the working class. And so it institutionalized differences, essentially defining some groups out of the working class. It also tied labor rights to full-time employment and to particular employers. So those workers, for example, who shifted from job to job were less likely to have those kinds of labor protections. Or those workers who work part-time rather than full-time were less likely to have those benefits. And so the New Deal, I think, ultimately, and labor regulation in this country, although an important step forward for some workers, actually narrowed the very definition of who is a worker and what is work. And so it created a category, excluded and included workers, that I think a division that was largely racial, but was also in part because of the equation of work with industrial or factory work, which was largely white and male. And I think this division between excluded and included worker is not a static one. It's one that's constantly shifting. So domestic workers, as Eileen said, were given minimum wage protection. At least some domestic workers were given minimum wage protection in 1974. And then public sector workers, a point of struggle in Wisconsin right now, were given the right to organize and bargain collectively in most states in the 1960s. So that included worker line, I think, has been a point of struggle, and a point of struggle that has been led primarily by workers' movements and workers organizing. And I think it's really, really important to think about that, because it is because of worker mobilization that we've seen an expansion of who's included in labor rights and who's not included. The Triangle Factory fire, I think, is etched in our mind, in part because the deaths of these young women really exposed to us the brutality of working conditions at the beginning of the 20th century, which led to the labor reform. But I think they're also etched in our minds because of their organizing efforts and their unionization campaigns, right? And as most of you know, the women who worked at the Triangle Factory fire were spearheading labor protests. There was a major protest in 1909 called the Uprising of 20,000, which led to improved wages, working conditions, and hours. And then another protest the following year, which led ultimately to union recognition for them. And we see, I mean, a similar parallel here in the contemporary period with groups that are excluded from labor regulation, leading another movement to try to redefine and expand the idea of labor rights. I'm not going to talk so much about Domestic Workers United. I think that's been pretty well covered. And as Joyce said, Domestic Workers United and the National Domestic Workers Alliance is working on multiple fronts, right? Locally here in New York, the passage of the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, first in the country. First in the country, so in that regard, it's a major achievement. They're working on a national level with the Department of Labor to institute national regulations for domestic work, and on the international level. And I think this is important also because these protections are not tied to a particular employer. They're tied to an occupation, right? So regardless of what your employer thinks, regardless of how your employer feels, these are going to be rights and protections to anybody who is in that occupation. But the other really exciting development that's happened over the past year is the formation of something called the Excluded Workers Congress, which was established last June at the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit. And Domestic Workers United, these women here, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, were central to the formation of the Excluded Workers Congress. The Excluded Workers Congress brings together 9 sectors of workers that have been organized over the past 2 decades, that have been denied basic labor protections, in particular the right to organize. It includes domestic workers, it includes agricultural workers, it includes restaurant workers, taxi drivers, day laborers, migrant workers or guest workers, workfare workers, formerly incarcerated workers, and workers in right-to-work states. Okay. The Excluded Workers Congress is really, I think, an important development in labor organizing today, right? Because it really does bring together a lot of marginalized groups who have been denied the right to organize, and really forming a united front to I think to help redefine the meaning of work, really, and who is a worker. They're expanding those boundaries that has been so narrowed by New Deal labor legislation, by the way in which the National Labor Relations Act has been implemented, and trying to include these other workers who are often denied basic labor rights. So they're trying to redefine the meaning of work, trying to expand the boundaries of the included worker. And I think in addition to that, trying to expand the substance of what it means to be an included worker. So it's not simply trying to expand that line, but also what does it mean to be an excluded worker. And we know that even though certain workers have been granted certain rights since the 1930s, those rights are slowly being eroded, as we saw in Wisconsin and in Ohio, North Carolina. There are public sector workers who do not have the right to organize. The Taft-Hartley Act, which was passed in 1947, also limited the rights of organized workers tremendously. So the Excluded Workers Congress is thinking outside of the box of...
Recall a moment in the mid-1930s when a lawyer with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union is testifying in Congress. And it's a hearing on labor standards. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing him, You know that old song, Home Sweet Home? Well, he says it ought more accurately be called Home Sweat Home. Now, he was referring to the exploitation and abuses in the garment sweatshop, particularly the putting out of manufacturing into the home as a form of women's labor, of low-paid women's labor. The garment workshop, of the sweatshops of the past, and domestic service share in that ideological sleight of hand that Home Sweet Home expresses. That binary between home and work, love and money, private and public, that privileges that first term, home, love, private, in order to obscure the power relation between the first and the second term, and to obscure the unequal relations based on race, gender, class, citizenship status of those who work in the home. Home labor has lent itself to abuses, not only due to such ideologies, that home somehow is this privileged realm, but also because workers have been scattered in individual spaces, and because its location did not fit into the industrial relations model that was created by unionists in other forms of workplaces, and because what is made in the home, people, did not fit into conventional standards of value added and production. The state, which so much for most of the heyday of the industrial relations regime excluded home-based workers, has also served as a terrain of struggle in which workers in the home have protested the violence of home exploitation and have demanded recognition, dignity, and rights. From the late 19th century, workers and their allies rallied against the sweatshop, which they understood as a place that literally sweated the labor of the worker by paying sub-minimum wages under unhealthful conditions and broke down the body through overtaxing speed up. There was never rest. Such labor was too heavy a burden. The phrase that African American women who cleaned and cooked and cared noted at the time, and yet the quest for labor standards, the fight against the sweatshop in factory and home that the Triangle aftermath did so much to advance, excluded a particular kind of home sweatshop, that of the private middle-class home with domestic service. A new generation of scholarship is recovering sweatshops in the home, not just garments, but also household employment, showing, as Vanessa May does in a forthcoming book, that even as white women reformers, middle-class women, in many women's trade union league, various women's clubs, lobbied to cover the factory and office girl under protective labor laws. They were reluctant to subject their own homes to labor inspection and labor standards. I'm talking about the middle-class allies. They were reluctant to cover immigrant and African American women whose labors made their own freedom possible, their freedom to engage in the professions and politics, voluntary activities in reform itself. These women reformers often preferred educating servants to be better servants, and spoke about training and the servant problem, complaining about the health, rather than wondering how working conditions, including the unfreedoms of being at the beck and call of mistresses and their children and subject to the sexual harassment of men of the house, the unfreedom of getting in-kind payment in goods rather than wages and higher wages, up to the period of partial enlightenment, because we know, because of the race and gender and racialized gendered exclusions of the New Deal, to the 1960s, who we fast forward during the period of civil rights struggles, even the President's Commission on the Status of Women, made up of the mainstream women's organizations, Black, Jewish, Catholic, the U.S. Women's Bureau, considered the modernization of domestic work. And they began pushing as a code of standards. I think they took those more literally than as a strategy that's being used today, but they also pushed for the inclusion of private household workers into the New Deal labor law regime. And there were associations, indeed unions, of household workers organized through the National Committee of Household Employment and the Housing Technicians of America, that Camilla is writing about, that really pushed for, they demanded the good wages. They testified before Congress. Workers are being considered, like all other workers, included in the labor law. This is what, of course, the Decent Work and Rights Campaign for Domestic Workers that has the convention before the International Labor Organization is also demanding. Include domestic workers under the labor law like other workers. But there also is some recognition of the particularities of this form of labor. That is, that some domestic workers live into their places of employment or have 24-hour shifts, and so they need the protection of an 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Domestic workers often can't go out for meals. They have to have kitchen privileges, and they have to have the right to cook food that they want to eat and not something that's just scraps from the table of the household. Paid vacations, paid sick days. These are all part of these codes of rights. Now, so there is this recognition of the home and domestic labor having its own occupational distinction, and there's also the care relationship itself, those bonds of care, which when respectful and attentive, enhances the effectiveness of the work performed as well as the intimate labor of the jobs. So we have to consider domestic workers as skilled workers, workers who are producing people. That's what care work is about. And even when you're cleaning a house, that is producing the environment for human life. Now, there's one form I will end with of care worker, of domestic worker, of home-based worker, who is explicitly excluded from the California law, and that is the in-home supportive service workers, the home health care workers that I'm writing a book with Jen Klein about. They are under the welfare law, and they're thought more of in terms of being quasi-public employees. There's been many battles over the years about that, who are paid through state funds, usually Medicaid funds, supplemental Social Security fund. And they're thought of as part of the welfare system rather than the labor system. And people focus on the recipients of the care rather than the providers, the workers themselves. And these are those workers that were explicitly excluded back in 1974, actually in 75, when the rules were made for implementing domestic workers in the labor law. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, I should also add, doesn't include payment for overtime, but that's a whole other story, for all private household workers. And so they were excluded. That was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2007. And the Obama administration, including Secretary Solis, have yet to rectify through new labor regulations. It's low in their total. Meanwhile, these Republican governors, like Wisconsin, are eliminating the collective bargaining rights of home health care workers and home child care workers. So an irony of the current struggles might be that these workers who have, for all intent and purposes, been recognized as public employees because the state's the only one they can bargain with, will end up, because of the attacks on collective bargaining of public workers, with fewer rights and poorer conditions than those who labor for individual housewives. Although they sometimes are the same people that go in and out of different workplaces. Thus, the strategies of private household workers offer a viable model of struggle for other home-based laborers under the heel of reduced public budget. It may be that the model that SEIU, in particular, and the trade unions so much did advance in the 90s, of bargaining at the top and getting the state to recognize these workers through the public budget, may not survive the current political forces, and that we need to look at the private household worker as the one to move forward.